Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we dig into your questions. The mailbag episode, the trade. Did the Bucks make the right move? Would you have been able to make that trade if you're John Horst? And thoughts on a potential Bucks decline. We get to all of your questions with Camille and Frank coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined once again by Camille Davis and Frank Madden. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out the Locked On Bucks newsletter. If you have not done so yet, you can sign up for free at lockedondaily.com. A lot of questions coming in from you guys. Let's waste no further time. On to today's mailbag. So it is the mailbag, All-Star Break mailbag edition of the show. We have quite a few questions that came in on Blue Sky, on Twitter, on YouTube in the comments, and the email address as well. So, Camille, you compiled all these into buckets by category, and I think just based on the volume of the questions that we got by category and just where everybody's interest is at, the most logical place to start is something that you and I have talked about before, but I don't know if we've gotten Frank's take on it. So not to start in a downer here, but the question comes to us from Jay on Twitter. Do you think the Giannis injury is something to worry about going forward? And I guess I'll take his question and combine it into something else for you specifically, Frank. Do you think we see Giannis on Thursday?
Good question. I mean, I'll say it should be something we worry about. I don't know if it's even like that specific injury that I'm worried so much as just like generically. Yeah. Just, like I think after the last 2 years, like you can't help but just be paranoid about the health of this team and staying healthy going into the playoffs. And so, I think there's two goals here over the last, third of the season. And it's one, just stay healthy preferably, or at a minimum, like be healthy by the playoffs, right? Since that just hasn't happened, or at least I guess technically they were healthy when the playoffs started 2 years ago. And then obviously, game one, Giannis, Kevin Love does his usual Kevin Love BS and Giannis then is, derailed. So I think stay healthy, job one. And then two, I think it's, stay ideally in the 4th spot or at worst the 5th spot. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm definitely, worried about Giannis's health in particular. I mean, he's obviously the single most indispensable player for this team. And for now it's the groin, because that's what's keeping him out. As for, is he going to be back on Thursday? I don't know. Maybe it's 50-50. Like, I mean, it would definitely be worrying if after all this time out that he can't come back, on that game. Cause I mean, would have like a full 7 days off in addition to all the time he had off prior to this. And so, yeah, I mean, it's concerning because, I mean, he came out and worked out. I forget which game it was, right? But I mean, he worked out. Yeah, he came out and did his pregame stuff, and they thought he was going to play in that game. And so I don't know, Justin or Camille, if you guys can recall exactly if the suggestion is he might have worsened it and done something in that warm up or something or what, but
yeah,
clearly, like, it's at a minimum, it didn't obviously get better quickly enough. And I guess we'll find out on Thursday, because Thursday will tell us, were they just sort of holding him out more from a precautionary perspective, which Doc paid lip service to the idea of like, oh, it was a playoff game, he'd play.
Heard that
okay. Yeah. So I think Thursday is going to be very telling, because even if you say, oh, it's only one more game, I mean, if he's not ready to come back, then obviously that injury, and sorry if I said groin, I don't know if I said groin, but it's obviously a calf injury, the same leg where he had the soleus injury, which again, like whether this is actually the same muscle, unclear, because there are multiple muscles in the calf and I had to go look this up again. So whether it's that specific muscle or the other muscle, or I don't know for sure, but yeah, I mean, I think it's fair that we would be concerned, given just the history of this and the fact that he's already missed, a number of games.
One thing I would add on to that quickly is that it's also a soft tissue injury, being a calf muscle, and those can be really tricky as well. So just something to keep an eye on. And I think having worry about it is fair and normal. Like, he is such a big part of what this team is banking on. If Giannis is not healthy, then the Bucks title shot is just out the window. So yeah, I think that it's fair to have concern around his health going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think Wednesday, when we see the injury report, is when you'll either be at ease or like, wait a minute, because what, the Grizzlies game was the last game he played in, so we're talking about 2.5 weeks since from Thursday's game to that game on the 2nd. So yeah, it should at least be elevated concern with the occurrences that we've seen with the calf issues for Giannis moving forward here. Another one that was very common. Another thing we've talked about, I think all three of us, the backup point guard spot. So from Jay on Twitter, would you rather see the backup point guard minutes go to Kevin Porter Jr. or Ryan Rollins? I guess let's just start with this part. And I know we have questions on the buyout market, but do you think it's just down to those two, or is there a potential for a point guard that's bought out that the Bucks have, maybe set their hopes on?
There wasn't anybody I was excited about when I took a look through who might potentially enter the buyout market. So for myself, there's no one who I was like, that'd be a game changer, or like, I would love for the Bucks to have them on the roster. So for me, my first answer to that is like nothing that I've seen rumored, but maybe someone else comes available who I didn't expect.
I've brought this name up a couple of times, and again, there's no indication he's getting bought out. It's
the
just
one, right? Remember a year ago? I had hoped that the Bucks might get DeLon Wright in the buyout market a year ago, and yeah, it's funny how that worked out.
Would you rather have Jevon Carter than either of those two?
It's an interesting call. He has a year. He has a year left beyond this. Is that right?
I believe.
Do you recall? So. I haven't really been assuming that he would get bought out, but it is kind of it has been a weird couple of years for him in Chicago, because he was obviously so good for the Bucks in his last year in Milwaukee and got paid a nice deal to go to Chicago, and it was kind of like, hey man, like, take the money, right? He obviously hasn't made a ton, but I mean, if you could get the prior version of Jevon Carter that we saw in Milwaukee, I would say like that's probably as good, maybe a little bit better than what we've seen from Rollins. But I'd say it's pretty close. I mean, Jevon like was basically kind of a shooting guard who could bring the ball up the floor, is kind of how I would characterize him, right? I mean,
an undersized shooting guard.
Yeah, exactly. But his defense, I think, in particular on the perimeter, getting over screens and stuff, I think he did a really nice job. So, hypothetically, I'd say like, yeah, if you got old Jevon, but I don't know if old Jevon is going to walk through that door, even if you signed him. So I don't know. I'll defer I'll let you guys talk about the KPJ Rollins sort of discussion. Only to say, like, I still assume Rollins is going to get converted once his games run out, which I think should probably be in a couple weeks or something like that.
Yeah.
So
I think he has 6 or 7 left.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So. And remember, it's active games. It's not games played per se.
Yeah.
So, so I think he is in the kind of lowish 40s, I want to say, and 50 is sort of the magic number. So I fully expect him to get, get the signed through at least next year, which they can do on a minimum contract. And I believe I was talking to our friend Van Fias about this as well. I mean, I think they technically have the taxpayer mid-level now as well, given that they're a fair amount under the second apron, but you can only do 2-year contracts anyway with that. So they could, in theory, pay him a little bit more. But I mean, really with Rollins, it's really about the years, right? If you could do 3 years, right, on a minimum, like that would be great. But I think from certainly everything I can figure out looking at the cap, I think they would be limited to rest of this year plus next year. But hey, fine, right? On a minimum contract, I think that's a no-brainer.
I think it depends a lot on what you're looking for out of your backup point guard. Like Jevon Carter, we know the defense is there, like he's going to pick you up full court, 94 feet. We know that he can do that. When it comes to initiating the offense, like he can bring the ball up through some pressure and whatnot, but he's not somebody who I would lean on as like, yeah, he's a great playmaker off the bench for your team going forward. But I also wouldn't give Rollins or KPJ that nod either of like, hey, here are some guys who can really set other guys up and get your playmaking on. So we can look at the defense, like Jevon Carter, if he became available on the buyout market. Of the three, like defensively, I like a lot of what he can do there. But the side, like the undersizedness of it all, it's like he can really only guard smaller guards at that point, and you might have a bit more versatility there with Rollins being able to guard up a little bit more given his wingspan and just a little bit taller of a player. And Kevin Porter Jr. has athleticism as well to keep up. I don't know if I would say KPJ is the same level of defender as Rollins at this point, but his athleticism allows him, even if he does make a mistake, to get right back into a play as well. So he has a little bit more shot creation as well offensively than what Rollins has. So if you're looking for a little bit more offense there, Kevin Porter Jr. feels like a great option. Looking for a little bit more defense, Rollins. But if you were using Jevon Carter hypothetically as a guy as well, then like that's the real defensive option there. But I like Rollins' versatility a bit more. And Kevin Porter Jr. just strikes me as a guy who can kind of get a shot a little bit easier than what Rollins can get. So to me, it really depends on what you're looking for out of that position. And maybe that's a good thing to have them both available. Like if you do convert Rollins, you can kind of use them situationally going forward based on what you actually need.
Yeah, I at one point went back and counted it up. I believe, because Frank, you mentioned it's you can't just look at the games played, it's the games you were active for. I think there was only 2 games that Ryan Rollins has been deemed inactive for. So we're really close to that limit here. Just to finish off the conversation on Jevon Carter that we were talking about before, he has a player option for next season. So you can't be bought out with that. So it's just a tossing around of, hey, comparable to what is likely going to be available on the market for buyouts. And again, his price range would fit in there as the below the full mid-level that the Bucks are up against. There's one other question on the point guards. We've gotten a lot of those, but a lot of questions that came in about somebody else that was brought in at the trade deadline. We'll get to that conversation and tackle those questions coming up after this. This is a message from sponsor Intuit TurboTax. Taxes are waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back, then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, and everything within 100% accuracy. All so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now, this is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at turbotax.com/guarantees. Before we get to the other player brought in, or one of the other players brought in at the deadline, I guess just who would you rather see get the minutes here? Ryan Rollins or Kevin Porter Jr.? If it's one guy's minutes to have, and this is what you're going forward with, who fits what this team needs the most for the rest of the season?
Frank, you want to give your opinion first?
I mean, I'll vote for Rollins just because, like, and as a fan, I don't want Kevin Porter Jr. on my favorite team. Like, I'm just going to be very direct about that. I mean, you know, like the history of him both on the floor, off the floor, the latest thing, and obviously the domestic violence charge that he pled guilty to in Houston. I mean, it is a long, history of just terrible decision making, and you hope for the sake of humanity that he has learned and is not going to do those things anymore. But, I think as fans, like, these are like the crappiest situations where it's like, I'm not going to tell any fan that they should, want KPJ on the team or that they should feel obligated to root for him or whatever, right? Because that stuff is real. Like I mean, it's not the first time, like whether it's, Jason Kidd or, even like Rodion's Kuruks, who had like I don't know that he ever pled guilty to something, but there was like, again, kind of a domestic situation that kind of was hanging over him when if people even remember Rodion's Kuruks, but he came over in a trade with the Nets a couple years ago, and then they released him, right? I mean, it's just like, I don't know.
They released him, or was he in the PJ Tucker trade?
That's a good. I thought he was waived, but I could be wrong.
Either way,
but regardless, nobody cared because he was Rodion's Kuruks, right? And so I think like your mileage may vary, like how much you believe in second, third, fourth chances, and how you sort of treat these situations as a fan. But it's hard, and I don't sort of judge anybody for how they kind of view these situations. But I don't know. I mean, like, I think if you just look at it strictly from a basketball standpoint, he's a wild card in pretty much every sense of the word. And I was kind of curious. I was like thinking, I mean, if he's not playing ahead of Rollins, like if he's not playing most nights, like, is he going to be a problem? Like, he seemed like a guy, like I could see him getting released before the end of the year, just because like maybe that becomes an issue for them in the locker room, right? I mean, part of what ran him out of Cleveland was literally with like, I think Taurean Prince in his locker. Yeah. I mean, so again, I mean, you hope that like he's past some of that stupid stuff that he had previously, but I don't know. I mean, I think from a talent standpoint, like if we put all that aside and you just say talent wise, he's obviously, a rotation caliber player in the NBA. And I mean, I remember doing kind of a bit of a deep dive on him a couple of years ago before kind of everything went down in Houston with his girlfriend at the time. And, even then people were like, this guy's like, and he had a lot of non-guaranteed money in his contract because of it, right? Because of the more team discipline stuff. And I mean, he was a super intriguing guy. Like, remember when we were all talking about like Colin Sexton and like who could be that like, sort of like scoring dynamic guy that you paired with Drew Holiday. And I thought Porter was a really interesting option because he could score, he could play make. His, I think, 3-point spot up shooting was really good that prior year as well. And I think he did enough defensively where you could kind of squint at it and be like, man, is there kind of an upside play here where he could be a much better player than, his contract then paid him. So again, like you saw flashes of it in Minnesota and he helped you win that game, but is that now going to be something you count on night tonight? I don't know. I think Rollins is still, I think, a better defender, and certainly Porter was a poor shooter. I mean, his efficiency numbers were really bad in LA. So I have no idea really what to expect from him night tonight, but there's talent there for sure. And I think certainly talent that we've seen that talent level certainly in the NBA, where Ryan Rollins obviously is still a younger guy that hasn't proven that as much, but I think he's certainly much more of a known quantity for the Bucks.
Higher risk, higher reward, probably with Porter, I would say. But the defense for Rollins stands out to me. And I think when trying to think of which of those two to go forward, my sample size of Porter Jr. is so much smaller than it is with Rollins, because we've seen Rollins throughout the season more often. I've seen Kevin Porter Jr. when, I tuned into a Clippers game, but I'm not watching as many Clipper games as I'm watching Bucks games. So for me, in thinking about it going forward, it's like, I think that the risk is really, it can be high with Kevin Porter Jr., but the reward could be great with him because we've seen him in other jerseys put together really big scoring displays. We've seen him execute
against the Bucks.
Yeah, against the Bucks at that.
I mean, it's crazy that a guy who was what was he, like 21 or something when he put 50 on Drew Holiday. Like the fact that we're here talking about him this way is like pretty disappointing, right? I mean, he's got to be very disappointed that his career has gone the way it has, but that's the reality.
That's the consequences of your actions at that point. So you can only continue to move. I mean, to be frank, like real here, like Ryan Rollins isn't in Milwaukee without the consequence of his actions that he took when he was in Washington.
He had to steal, like stealing, right? Yeah.
So like you are what your experiences are, and they lead you to a certain point. So I want to see more of what Porter looks like, what he can do in a Bucks jersey. But I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the potential that Rollins does have, because we've seen him have some bad games recently, but the potential is still there, I think, for him to be a really solid player.
Yeah. I mean, I still fully expect him to get converted eventually here. I just don't know that there's anything on the market. I don't know how much of this is the Bucks just drawing it out and saying we already got under the second apron, let's continue to save more money and wait until we upgrade it, versus just waiting to see what's available. I don't think there's going to be much available for them. So I think he ultimately fills that spot. I think the only concern, and not even concern, but just monitoring point, what you mentioned, Camille, it does seem like he's maybe started to hit the wall in these past couple of weeks. So just keeping an eye on that. But again, that's where I suppose Kevin Porter Jr. is your insurance to that. Was he, to wrap the Kevin Porter Jr. discussion, was he the soup thrower in Cleveland? Was he related to that incident?
I think the soup was in that J.R. Smith.
I think that was
J.R. Smith. Okay,
I'm pretty sure J.R. Smith was the soup thrower.
Same era of the Cavs.
Yeah,
though.
Exactly. It was the soup throwing era. The only other thing I'd say on the KPJ thing is that, like, and I don't know a lot about obviously what was going on with the Clippers, but I'm a little surprised in hindsight because he's a player option for next year, which again, if he plays really well, then you're going to say like, well, then he'll opt out and, go sign some new deal somewhere. But like, if things don't go well, then it's like you've got, $2.5 million or whatever he's owed on your cap for next year. And obviously the Clippers were like,
we're good.
Yeah, pretty much. We don't need that.
No, thanks. It's still a little interesting to me that like they didn't get like a top 55 protect pick or something out of that. Yeah. It would be interesting. I mean, they must have valued him somehow. Yeah. Like they must have valued KPJ's basketball ability, because I don't think you do this trade, take on that extra year obligation, and then just say like, well, we're not actually going to play him. He's just going to be on the bench, and like maybe we have to release him if he becomes a problem, right? Like they must have seen something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it is such a small amount. I mean, like every dollar counts, as we've seen the last few years, but it's $2.5 million. But still, the fact that I suppose you could have the inverse conversation too of, the Bucks had no intention of bringing back Marjan Beauchamp. He wasn't going to be a part of this team, and he was already out of the rotation. And you get Kevin Porter Jr. as flawed player, but you get that back in exchange for him. So yeah. To move on to another player acquired at the trade deadline, I think, Camille, this was the guy we got the most questions about. So I'm just going to combine all these into one, because somebody put together very thought out questions and scenarios. Others just straight up ripped off the Band-Aid. So we'll do that. Why haven't we seen Jericho Sims on the floor yet?
I have my theories. I think right now the answer to why we haven't seen Jericho Sims, especially with Giannis not being active, which is a situation when you would expect to see another big enter the rotation, is because Doc has been running Kuz as that third big in his rotation. And it seems as if he still prefers a 3 big man rotation in his lineups. And unfortunately, that keeps Jericho Sims on the outside looking in. I did think that we should have at least seen him in that, I think it was the Warriors game, when Bobby and Brooke both looked like they just didn't have it. And it was like, well, just see what else you can throw out there and see if it works. In that game, I was a little surprised not to see him, but seeing how they're using Kuz, I think that's why we haven't seen Sims so far.
Yeah, I mean, the simplest theory is that Jericho Sims just isn't a very good NBA basketball player.
Oh no.
And that, the trade was more about, just getting kind of the break in case of emergency big for DeLon Wright, who obviously was, they obviously were not hoping to break that cover off from a point guard standpoint. So, I mean, look, I get it. Like, nobody's seen him like really play basketball. So like, that's probably the people that are the most curious to see him play and most want to see him play. He's got obviously nuclear athleticism and physical tools. He's probably not a guy that you want kind of touching the ball unless it's to finish an alley-oop, right? So come in and give you like some energy, change of pace, or some fouls when you need size and whatever, like one of your other bigs is out. Like, I'm not going to say that can't be a thing, but then again, it felt like shades of Mamadi Diakite and Mo Bamba wish casting, where it's like picking random dudes. And to be clear, like, I guess Mo Bamba has like played like semi-real minutes at various points in his career. But, I think it's just sort of like, this is usually kind of the people that get frustrated, with Brooke, Bobby, etc. Like just sort of like seeing a shiny object and like hoping that like, oh, it can't be worse. Like, no, it can be way worse than the guys you have right now. Those are like real NBA basketball players who contribute and have contributed to winning basketball. And, Jericho Sims at this point, like, is still kind of at best probably a mystery box. So look, I'm curious. Like, I would like to see at some point. It'd be interesting to see him just what he looks like on the floor. But I would say, again, probably most of the interest is because of kind of the highlight reel and his vertical leap numbers more so than anything that he's actually shown on a basketball court. So yeah, maybe we'll see someone at some point, but he's not the answer to any of the Bucks' real problems.
No. I think it's a lot of what you said, and also, I mean, I don't think this is the primary reason, but I do think part of it too is the importance of bigs in this system that Greg Buckner runs. Of, we got to drill this into you. This is the way that we need you to play. I mean, I've seen so many people taking a run with Jericho Sims and just looking at the highlight reels and say, well, this is exactly what we've been calling for. And maybe not paying attention to the numbers or his role in New York and the fact that the Knicks were desperate for bigs earlier in the season too, and he still couldn't really crack the rotation. And people pointed out, is this a poor man's Daniel Gafford? Like, no, there's no rim protection from a 6'9" guy. So it's something to at least say, hey, can we develop this? Sure. But I don't think Jericho Sims is the answer for this year in terms of this is the card that we had up our sleeves. If for no other reason too, then if, and Frank, you mentioned this, like if his offense is basically rim rolling, can you play him with Giannis? It's the same conversation that we had with Andre Jackson Jr., that you're just going to start to load up these non-shooters and it changes how you're defended once you get into the postseason. So I think we're all kind of aligned on why we haven't seen Jericho Sims yet. Not to say that we won't see him at some point this season, but I think we need to temper expectations quite a bit there on the Jericho Sims experience. We have a couple more to get to. A lot on Chris Middleton. We mentioned the name of Andre Jackson Jr. We'll get to that as well. But this version of the mailbag, I want to wrap up with a more unique set of questions. So we'll get to that coming up after this. This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Hungry Root. When it comes to grocery shopping and meal planning, we've all had this ongoing problem. You just don't have the time between work, life, and trying to eat healthier. You're constantly feeling stressed out. You go to the grocery store and buy things you don't need and then end up with no time to actually cook. Sticking to your health goals, that's always a struggle too. But everything changes when you discover Hungry Root. They are an absolute game changer, the easiest way to eat healthy without all the stress. With Hungry Root, it's like having a personal shopper and a nutritionist all in one. They'll take care of your grocery shopping, recommending meals and groceries based on your tastes and health goals, from anti-inflammatory to high protein and gluten-free options. The best part, every meal is ready in 15 minutes or less. Healthy meals that actually taste great, all delivered straight to your door. It is a huge time saver. It'll be healthy eating so much simpler. You're going to love Hungry Root once you get started. For a limited time, get 40% off your first box and a free item in every box for life. Just go to hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA. That's hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA, code LockedOnNBA to get 40% off your first box and a free item of your choice for life. hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA, code LockedOnNBA. Don't miss out. Okay, as I mentioned, we have plenty of questions to get to on the usuals. Brook Lopez and his minutes, the Chris Middleton trade revisited, Andre Jackson Jr.'s defense. We're going to save those for part 2 of the mailbag, but I want to wrap up this episode with 2 very interesting questions that came to us on YouTube in the comment sections, and it's about our Bucks fandom. So we'll start with this one that comes to us from @Forte. Who was your first influence of becoming a Bucks fan? I'll start with this. I think just growing up in the area and loving basketball, like that was number one. But to take his question and point to a singular player, the guy that, I mean, it was entrenched and I'm never going back, was Glenn Robinson. I was always a big dog guy over Ray Allen, and as soon as the Bucks got him, yeah, it's a wrap. I'm with this team forever.
For me, it was that same, a little bit later in that era. I grew up a Jordan kid. I grew up in the house with my uncles, and they always were watching ball, and we were able to get WGN. So I saw the Bulls games growing up. But when Jordan retired, and I was like, okay, what is my focus going to be? Ray Allen, 34, like seeing him hoop and seeing that era of Bucks basketball with Big Dog, and then Sam Cassell comes, and then it was just like that era of Bucks basketball really encapsulated me to the point where I will never forget being at a middle school dance, and the DJ booth, he had a little screen with the playoff game against the Hornets up on his screen. And I'm standing over there with a whole bunch of other like little boys, and we're like watching the game. Like, I can't believe like look the Bucks, what they gonna do here? So like that era really got me into it. But like my fandom reached a different level actually during like the Brandon Jennings Bucks days. Because I was in college, it was cheap to get to the games, and I went to a lot of Bucks games. Being able to sit courtside for like $70 made me feel like the richest person in the world. And I really like dived into my love of the Bucks during those green and red years. The Brandon Jennings years would really solidified it for me.
The Christmas tree Bucks years.
The Christmas tree Bucks. Yes. You know, you had to be a fan if you were wearing that gear, because it was not the most pleasing gear.
Hideous. Yeah. I mean, between the color scheme, the fact that it was Adidas, it was a rough time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I moved to Wisconsin in 1989. I was 8 years old. And then I kind of became a sports fan probably in like around like 1991. I kind of like consciously like decided like I wanted to start like following basketball and football and baseball. And so my first favorite NBA player was David Robinson, and my dad was in the Army for 25 years. So like David Robinson being, you know, a Navy guy, and you know, just like an upstanding, like good person who, you know, like did well on his SATs and was a very smart guy. Like that was kind of a very like natural, like, oh, I really like this guy. And of course, the fact that he was just like an incredible athlete and explosive dunker and super fun to watch. So David Robinson was like my first kind of favorite NBA player. And so for the first, like probably like, you know, honestly, like throughout the 90s, like the Bucks kind of defaulted to my favorite, to my kind of like home team. Obviously, I remember going to my first game. I think it was in the 91-92 season. My dad took me to a game, and Moses Malone was playing for the Bucks at the time. I remember Moses like being good in that game. And then he got season tickets for starting the following year, so 92-93, and we went to draft night, the draft night party that they held at the BC. And I still remember, I still have it at home. They handed out these Upper Deck, like big commemorative like cards that had pictures of the first overall picks from like the last, it was since like, I think it was since 84. It was basically like, or no, it was like 85. So it was like Ewing, you know, Ewing, Brad Daugherty, Purvis Ellison, David Robinson. I'm going to miss, I had it memorized for the longest time, but you know, through the list, basically Derek Coleman, Larry Johnson, and then Shaq was 92. And so, so that kind of like started my Bucks fandom. And, you know, I think we had, I can't remember, I think we split a 20 pack like initially. And so I would go to like 10 games a year with my dad. And that kind of just became a thing that we did. And then, you know, got better and better seats over the years. And obviously like by the time I was going to college, then that was sort of like the big three at the beginning of the big three era. And I remember coming home from college and going to one of the Eastern Conference Finals games against the Sixers. But yeah, so that was kind of like the start of it. So really my dad kind of deciding like, hey, you know, you seem to like basketball, let's go get Bucks season tickets. Like that was, you know, a really kind of formative thing in my, you know, certainly my fandom of the Bucks. And again, I mean, I was local, so I mean, I was going to watch Bucks games probably regardless, but that obviously like kind of made it real for me and gave me a chance to see, you know, Jordan and David Robinson and kind of all the great 90s players. And I think, you know, I actually like the Bulls. Like the Bulls I rooted for in the postseason. They were probably my third favorite team. I rooted for the Bucks over them when they played, but again, like in the 90s, like the Bucks weren't in the playoffs, so it wasn't it wasn't like I felt bad rooting for the Bulls in the East, and the Spurs obviously, and until finally making it against the Knicks in 99, were never in the finals, so there was never any kind of conflict there. But yeah, so I was like Bucks Spurs Bulls. That was like my formative years. And like you, Justin, I think we've talked about this, like Big Dog. I still remember being in my house and seeing the Bucks win the draft lottery and running out. My dad was in the garden, like gardening stuff. It was a nice May day, I think, and running out and saying, like, we got Big Dog, and that was like kind of that like hope, right? That Glenn Robinson was going to be our superstar. And so, yeah, I always sort of anchored on that, and I was sort of loyal to Big Dog sort of throughout those years. And Ray Allen, like I liked, but I never connected with him as like a fan in that same way, even though, especially with hindsight and advanced statistics, it's clear that Ray was the better player.
It's clear we picked the wrong guy, not only in that debate, but in the draft itself. But still, you're not going to be able to take that from me. I remember the same thing, just watching the draft lottery on NBC and seeing the Bucks won it, and like going outside and playing basketball with kids in my neighborhood. I remember too, like begging my parents after the draft to get one of the Glenn Robinson jerseys, which they were like, we're not buying you a basketball jersey back then. And so I had a Glenn Robinson t-shirt jersey that lasted me all throughout college and then some. And that was like my prized Bucks possession. But yeah, it was pretty rough to grow up liking basketball and watching the Bucks in the early 90s, in the early days of the Bradley Center. Like, you basically went there to see the opposing team. Like, I would go every year for my birthday, and I would go every year whenever the Phoenix Suns were in town because I love Charles Barkley. But other than that, it was just, can we go to the Bucks game? Because I want to see the Shaq guy. Like, that's the reason you were going.
The reason, part of why Ray Allen also captured my attention, Game came out in 98, 99. I should not have been watching that movie when it came out. I was not old enough to watch that movie when it came out, but I saw Jesus Shuttlesworth and I was like, man, and he plays for my team in Milwaukee. Like, I'm here for it. I'm here for all of it.
What was
other than you being just a smarter person than Justin and I as a fan? That was
it. That sold it. He's a Spike Lee
into advanced stats early and connectivity. What was the speaking of Glenn and those Purdue teams? Frank, do you remember, maybe you do, Camille, what was the blog that was out like 10, 15 years ago from the kid that went to Purdue that was like in with the team and had stories from that era of just how terrible some of the guys were? He never listed anybody by name, but you could read between the lines and get the sense, I'm pretty sure he's talking about Glenn in this one, or he's talking about Quanzo Martin here. I think it was like basketwaffle.com.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I'm not going to look that up because I don't want to tarnish my fandom.
It's long gone now.
I mean, and Glenn, for people who weren't watching college basketball then, I mean,
he was
like the dominance. Dominance Glenn had in Purdue. I mean, to be a 30-10 guy in the Big Ten in the 90s, or I mean any decade, but to be that dominant was crazy. And just like, he was just, I mean, a different beast when it came to college basketball. And I think it was Kansas. He had that monster game in the tournament against Kansas where he put up like, I think 40 plus. And I mean, he was just really a man among boys. And I mean, obviously it just never quite got to that level in Milwaukee, but it was, he was a good player. I remember I think he scored like 39 against the Bulls in a season finale one year when the Bucks weren't making the playoffs, and it was like, oh yeah, this might, maybe this is it, right? But no, shout out to Big Dog. I rooted for his son too, GR3 at Michigan, because of my nostalgia. So
and with the Wisconsin Herd.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, watched a lot of Herd games to see GR3.
It is basketballful.com. I just looked it up and risked getting all the viruses, but we're good. And it's still active. He did an update in 2022, but the initial post was from 2009 and talking about his freshman year of college. I don't know if he mentions Purdue by name, but you can read between the lines. It's Purdue and piece together some of the players that he's talking about. So check that one out if you have not. I mentioned we got a ton of questions. We're going to break this off into a part 2. So in that second episode of the mailbag, we'll get to thoughts that everybody seems to have on Brooke Lopez, the Bucks title window, the Chris Middleton trade, and John Horst, some thoughts that people have shared on him as well. So we'll get to that. Look for that on part 2 of the mailbag that comes your way after this. Okay, plenty of more questions to get to coming up on part 2 of the mailbag. You can find that on tomorrow's episode. For Camille and Frank, I'm Justin. We will talk with you guys once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.